You're listening to the boring history for sleep. Why medieval beds were so short. A gentle journey into the curious world of medieval sleep, where the beds were tiny and the nights were long. Hey guys, tonight we're curling up in something you might call a bed butt. It's shorter, lumpier, and probably crawling with at least one bug you've never seen before. Imagine yourself in a cold, smoky medieval chamber. The fire has died down to embers. Your straw mattress creaks as you shift, legs bent like a folded paperclip, because if you try to stretch out fully, your feet dangle into the cold air. There's a musty wool blanket over your shoulders, and it smells faintly like the sheep it came from. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing who's drifting off across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink in the gloom, adjusting to the flicker of a candle stub. The bed you've just climbed into is absurdly small, more like a wide bench with a headboard than anything remotely sleepworthy. Your knees are bent, and your heels are practically touching your backside. And this is normal. The myth that medieval people were all significantly shorter than we are today. Not entirely true. The average adult male in Europe during the Middle Ages stood around 5 feet 6, not radically different from modern standards. Yet the beds remained curiously compact, and it's not just because of their size. Some theories suggest medieval folks preferred to sleep partially upright, maybe because of respiratory issues, maybe because sitting up made you seem less like you were, well, dead. That would have been a major vibe-killer. So yes, while they were often a bit shorter, that's not why their beds would give your shins an existential crisis. Instead, it was often about posture, practicality, and protection from unseen threats. You pull the wool blanket up to your chin, and it prickles your skin. Everything in this room feels like it belongs to someone with a strong tolerance for discomfort. There's a pile of logs nearby, stacked neatly beside the hearth. One of them is probably home to a beetle or two. Above you, a thick canopy hangs from the bed frame, woven tightly to keep out drafts and, occasionally, rats dropping in from the thatched roof above. It's like medieval people designed every part of their bed out of fear. And to be fair, they had reason. Even falling asleep back then came with risks. The combination of wood smoke, low ventilation, and poor insulation meant you either froze or suffocated. There wasn't really a cozy middle. But still, these beds were precious. Even a tiny, cramped one like this might be the most expensive object in the house. Medieval wills often list beds as high-value items passed down through generations. They were prized, even if they barely worked for modern humans. You look down at your feet, curled like a shrimp in a shallow pan. There's no mattress, as you'd recognize it, just a sack filled with straw, feathers if you're lucky, or rushes if you're not. The bed creaks with every breath, and the smell of old wood, ancient cloth, and the faint aroma of dried herbs tickles your nose. Historians still argue whether the short length was entirely about sleep posture, or if it also reflected social rituals. Some believe that sitting up in bed allowed people to receive guests, or even conduct business in the bedroom, sort of a medieval Zoom call and bed setup, minus the internet, and plus a chamber pot, if you're in a peasant's home. This little bed might be shared with a spouse, a child, and maybe even a visiting cousin. Privacy didn't exist, and neither did personal space. Think bunking in economy class with 3 toddlers and no headphones. Forever. You wiggle your toes and touch the rough linen of the bedsheets. Linen was expensive, so it might have been saved for feast days or when noble guests came by. Otherwise, you're probably sleeping on wool coarse, itchy, and never quite dry in the damp winter air. Above you, the low ceiling creaks as someone or something shifts in the loft. Could be the family cat, could be a child, could be a squirrel. You don't ask. In medieval life, it's best not to know. Your back starts to itch. The straw in the mattress pokes through the fabric in fine little needles, and you suddenly appreciate every coil, spring, and memory foam innovation that came centuries later. But even this lumpy bedding is a treasure compared to what many had, just a pile of hay on the floor, if that. And yet, this is where they dreamed, where they laughed, where they clutched each other during stormy nights, and where generations were born, slept, and died. Your breath fogs in the cold air. You close your eyes, trying to ignore the sharp straw poking your ribs, and you think, maybe short beds were less about size, and more about survival. You wake, well, not really wake, more like shift stiffly to the sensation of your own chin resting on your chest. That's because you've dozed off sitting up, not propped casually on pillows like in a hotel lounge, but seated almost bolt upright like you're expecting to deliver a sermon or stand trial. Your legs are still bent, your shoulders slumped, and your lower back already begging for a chiropractor who won't exist for another 800 years. But that's exactly how many people slept during the Middle Ages, partially upright, with a stiff formality that makes modern rest seem like luxury laziness. Why? Well, depending on who you ask. It was about everything from superstition to sanitation. For starters, sleeping sitting up was believed to aid digestion. After all, if you went to bed with a belly full of meat pie and weak ale, both likely questionable in quality, lying flat might lead to some medieval acid reflux that could ruin your entire week. Upright posture helped keep things, shall we say, contained. But it wasn't just about bodily fluids. People genuinely feared the vulnerability of lying flat. That position resembled a corpse, and being mistaken for dead wasn't something you wanted to happen in a time when the phrase "he's resting" might precede your funeral. And then there were demons. You hear a creak again above the rafters, just wind. You hope, but back then, folks feared spirits might visit at night, particularly the ones that sat on your chest and made it hard to breathe. Modern science calls this sleep paralysis. Medieval people called it a demon. Tomato. Sleeping partially upright was thought to protect against these night terrors. The logic was fuzzy, but firm. You can't be possessed by a spirit if you're sort of halfway awake, right? Makes perfect sense. At 2 a.m. with no lighting and a belly full of suspicious sausage. In fact, religious imagery of the time often showed saints and monks sleeping upright. It looked pious, noble, alert, as if even in sleep they remained watchful and prepared. And if you were a medieval noble, being seen as devout even while dozing was just good branding. So, beds were arranged accordingly. Instead of pillows, you'd have bolsters, long, firm cushions that propped you up like an overly supportive grandma. Your back against the headboard, your legs curled under a coarse wool coverlet, and maybe a carved crucifix overhead to ward off evil dreams and judgmental spirits. Historians still argue whether the average peasant copied this upright sleep style from monks and nobles, or whether it evolved more organically, possibly from the need to share crowded beds without smothering each other in the night. Try lying flat with 2 other adults and a toddler in a tiny bed. Someone's getting elbowed. Upright, at least, you can stagger your heads and breathe. And let's not forget illness. Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, was rampant. It attacks the lungs, and anyone who's tried to sleep during a chest infection knows upright is easier. So if your cousin Robert had a wet cough for the 5th winter in a row, everyone in bed sat up out of sympathy or self-preservation. You pull the wool blanket tighter, feeling it scratch against your neck. Your head droops again. It's hard to fight the downward pull of gravity when your body craves sleep and your wooden pillow has all the give of a dinner plate. But comfort wasn't exactly the point. Discipline, health, and holiness came first. Occasionally, though, you find exceptions. Wealthier households had curtained beds, 4-posters that allowed for privacy and retained warmth. Inside those drapes, maybe you'd recline a bit more, especially if you had the luxury of being alone in bed. Even the most stoic sleeper might slide down a little, like a sneaky middle schooler trying to nap during assembly. But for most people, sleep was a communal, conscious, even performative act. Entire families might sit upright together in bed, chatting before rest, whispering prayers, or even exchanging gossip. Bedtime wasn't just sleep, it was connection. It was where songs were hummed, stories told, and comfort shared before plunging into the literal and spiritual darkness of the night. And if you did try to lie down fully, good luck. The mattress was uneven, the cold seeped in through every inch of exposed wall, and unless you were rich enough for a feather bed, the idea of sinking into softness was mostly poetic nonsense. A few bold souls might stretch out for a bit of comfort, but they did so at risk. Lying completely flat made it harder to hear a child crying, or livestock stirring, or worse, a thief creeping in. Beds were often placed near windows or doors, so staying semi-upright helped you stay alert. It's like sleeping with one eye open, just both eyes and your whole torso. Even your dreams were shaped by your posture. Upright sleepers tended to remember more vivid episodic dreams, possibly because the posture disrupted deeper sleep cycles. It's ironic. Medieval folks feared dreams might be portals for spirits, yet they practically engineered their own dream enhancement technology by accident. You shift again, spine curved awkwardly like a question mark, and wonder how anyone thought this was restful. But to them, it wasn't about luxury. It was about making it through the night alive, uncursed, and ready for the next day of farming, fasting, or fending off famine. You sigh and let your head rest against the creaky wooden headboard. The wind howls faintly outside. Someone coughs. In another bed. The candle is out. The room is black. And you try to imagine a time when this strange upright perch was not only common, but considered best practice. Welcome to sleep in the Middle Ages. Sit up. Stay alert. And if you hear whispering, pretend you didn't. Morning light hasn't yet broken through the small, warped glass window when your lower back reminds you exactly how firm the medieval definition of comfort is. You shift again, trying to ease the cramp forming in your shoulder, only to feel something poke through the surface of your so-called mattress. Not a spring, those don't exist yet, but something pointier, possibly straw, possibly a twig, possibly a beetle. You don't want to know. Welcome to the medieval mattress, if you can even call it that. Unlike your memory foam or down-filled luxury topper, this is more of a loosely stuffed bag. Literally, just a large sack filled with whatever happened to be available. Straw was the go-to filler for peasants, cheap, plentiful, and fairly easy to replace. But don't imagine golden, hay-scented softness. The stuff they used was rough, dry, and scratchy, and once it started breaking down, and it always did, it transformed from mild discomfort to outright punishment. It crackled with every move, like you were trying to nap on a snack wrapper. And worse, it attracted visitors, because straw, you see, is organic. Organic means food. Food means bugs. So it wasn't unusual to find yourself sharing your mattress with lice, mites, or the occasional ambitious mouse. Wealthier homes sometimes added herbs like lavender, mint, or wormwood into the stuffing to repel these unwelcome guests and add a little scent. Think of it as medieval aromatherapy, or possibly medieval denial, if you were slightly better off. You might sleep on a palisa thicker tick mattress, with feathers or flock that shredded fabric mixed into the straw. Soft, slightly luxurious. Only if you've never met a real pillow. Historians still argue whether common households regularly maintained or cleaned these bedding materials. Some sources suggest straw was replaced a couple of times a year, especially after winter. Others argue that families simply slept through the slow composting of their own beds for as long as humanly tolerable. Let's just say, medieval noses had to be resilient. And don't get too attached to the idea of a dedicated mattress, either. If you're in a poor home, More staying at an inn with limited space, you might sleep directly on a wooden bench, a rope lattice, or the packed dirt floor, cushioned only by your cloak and some bundled clothing. Or, in a truly humbling twist, you might sleep in a pile of hay shared by humans and livestock alike. Medieval bunkmates came in all species. You swing your legs off the edge of the bed, or rather the sack of crunch, and place your feet on the cold floor. There's no rug, no slippers, just the bite of winter air and a few scattered reeds thrown down to soak up. Let's call it domestic moisture. You try not to think too hard about it. Back to the bed, its frame, if there is one, is a basic wooden structure, often handmade, with pegs instead of nails. No screws, no fancy joints. If you're lucky, it's off the ground raised beds, were safer from dampness, pests, and the creeping cold. If you're not, you're basically camping, indoors for the rest of your life. Still, for the truly rich, things could get a little fancy. Feather beds were a status symbol, often made from goose down if you could afford the labor of plucking geese and the risk of being pecked into next week. Feather beds were layered on top of a basic straw or wool mattress, offering that luxurious sleeping on a cloud vibe that the nobility liked to flaunt. But with that softness came cost. Beds were often so valuable they were listed in wills, passed down to heirs like family jewels. Imagine fighting your siblings not over the house, but over Great Aunt Hilda's lumpy mattress. It happened. A decent bed could be worth more than the average peasant made in several years. You lean back again, feeling the uneven texture beneath you. There's a lump on your left side, probably a clump of straw, or maybe your dignity trying to escape. Medieval beds had no uniform shape or size. Each one was as unique as the person who built it. Some had 4 short legs, others none. Some had wooden slats underneath. Others relied on interlaced ropes for support. And if you think that sounds bouncy and fun, think again. Sagging ropes turned beds into hammocks of doom. Every night became a gentle battle against gravity and structural failure. You shift again, trying to find that elusive non-stabby spot. Medieval people did the same. They rolled, they readjusted, and they often woke up sore. But that didn't mean they saw anything wrong with it. Discomfort was simply part of life. If the bed kept you off the damp floor and gave you a place to curl up for a few hours, it had done its job. Some beds had extra sacks you could stuff with moss, old rags, or leaves. Think of it as DIY comfort, just a bit more crunchy and a lot less sanitary. Over time, the filler flattened, turned musty, and invited an entire ecosystem into your sleeping space. And yet, even with all that, the mattress was a point of pride. A full bedding setup included layers, bottom mattress straw or flock, possibly a feather topper, then linens, then woolen blankets, then a coverlet or quilt. It was an ordeal to make and an even bigger ordeal to clean, which, let's be honest, probably didn't happen much. You stretch your arms over your head, fighting the crunch of old straw and the rising sense of appreciation for your own modern bed. Whatever its flaws, at least it doesn't need to be refilled every season or swept out for mice. Still, you have to respect the ingenuity. With no factories, no memory foam, no gel cooling pads, people made do. They layered natural materials, adjusted based on the seasons, and figured out how to sleep through more pokes, creaks, and crawls than you could dream of. So tonight, as you lie there imagining the rustle of dry straw beneath your spine, remember, this lumpy sack beneath you was someone's sanctuary, their refuge, their haven from frost and fear. It may be prickly and pungent, but it kept them dreaming. You open your eyes slowly to the sound of someone breathing very close to your ear. Too close. You shift just slightly and bump into a warm body. Not in a cozy a dog jumped on the bed kind of way, but in the there's-a-full-grown-human-this blanket kind of way. Welcome to communal sleeping, medieval style. You're not alone. In fact, You're probably never alone. Not at bedtime, not in this bed, and not in this century. Because in the Middle Ages, privacy wasn't really a thing. Beds were often shared, and not just between couples, entire families, regularly bundled together in the same sleeping space. Parents, children, grandparents, and occasionally a passing stranger with good manners and vague references. The logic was simple. Body heat meant survival. And if that meant squeezing into bed with your cousin Agnes and her snoring husband Wilfred, so be it. You try to adjust, but something brushes against your leg. Not Wilfred. Something smaller. Something with legs. You remember that medieval mattresses, those crunchy sacks of straw or feathers, were a haven for bugs. Bed bugs, fleas, mites, and especially lice. They were common enough that people barely remarked on them unless things got truly out of hand. If you were wealthy, you might boil your linens or bake your mattress in the sun to try to kill the critters. If you were poor, you scratched, and scratched, and scratched. In fact, the act of nitpicking, literally combing lice and eggs from someone's hair, was often a shared bedtime ritual. A moment of bonding, you could say. Kind of like Netflix and chill, except you're hunched over your spouse's scalp with a bone comb, muttering curses under your breath. Historians still argue whether people really tolerated the infestations, or if they simply had no better option. Did they clean themselves more than we think? Were some homes relatively vermin-free, or did everyone just develop calloused patience and a high itch threshold? You certainly don't have that threshold. Not yet. You pull the blanket up over your shoulders and try not to think about what might be crawling in the seams. A faint, musky scent clings to the fabric wool, damp wood, and something vaguely human. It's not exactly unpleasant, just persistent. You turn your head slightly and realize that there's someone else on the other side of you. Again, hopefully, human. Beds weren't always built for one or two people. In many homes, the bed was the only piece of sleeping furniture in the entire house, so everyone piled in. In inns or hostels, it wasn't uncommon for strangers to share a mattress if space was tight. You might even rent half a bed for a night. No, not like that. Just literal bed sharing. You take the left, the other traveler takes the right. Pray they don't snore. If that sounds wildly uncomfortable, consider the alternative: sleeping on the cold ground or pressed against drafty stone walls in freezing temperatures. So yes, people endured close quarters and questionable hygiene for the sake of warmth. Proximity wasn't optionally, was survival. And not everyone slept at the same time either. Households operated on irregular sleep schedules. A child might climb in after finishing chores. A laborer might nap before heading out for pre-dawn work. People came and went. Beds were like taxis, you just climbed in when needed. This whole situation was especially dicey in large manors or royal courts, where servants often slept near their lords, sometimes on benches, sometimes on the same bed platform. There are records of kings hosting important guests in bed, lounging semi-reclined, talking politics and contracts between sips of wine and strategic burps. You stretch your legs slightly and bump someone else's foot. This one's small and cold. A child. Likely children weren't tucked away in cribs. They were right there, often wedged between adults like living, wiggling bed warmers. Babies slept, swaddled, toddlers often in arms. There was risk. Of course, accidental smothering was tragically common. But with no baby monitors or nurseries, keeping your child close was the only option. And speaking of proximity, you hear a faint buzzing. A mosquito. Maybe. But it reminds you of a more serious visitor. Fleas. During plague years, fleas were deadly hitchhikers, and beds, those warm, straw-stuffed nests, were their paradise. So, people burned herbs at night, or slept with garlic, amulets, or wore nightcaps soaked in vinegar. Anything to ward off death. Bed. You roll to your side and accidentally inhale someone's hair. Definitely will. You make a mental note to scoot toward the wall, and immediately regret. if the wall is damp, cold, and slightly sticky. Not sticky like jam, sticky like never mind. There's an odd kind of intimacy to this arrangement. No one talks, everyone's breathing slow and heavy, rhythms overlapping. The room creaks, and outside, you hear the distant howl of the wind. In this moment, you understand why sharing a bed wasn't just convenience, it was comfort, an emotional, if slightly itchy, security blanket. Medieval people didn't see shared beds as strange. They saw them as normal, even sacred. Marriage. Beds were often blessed. Monks slept in dormitories in rows of beds arranged by seniority. Travelers bunked together and forged friendships, sometimes lifelong, from a single shared night. So as you lie there, curled tightly on your sliver of the straw sack, listening to snores and scratching and occasional murmurs, remember, this was how people lived for centuries. Huddled together, breathing each other's air, hoping the lice took the night off. You close your eyes again and let the sleep creep back in. Not because it's comfortable, but because it's warm, and sometimes that's all you need. At some point in the night, probably while adjusting your leg away from a louse hotspot, or gently elbowing Wilfred to stop snoring directly into your soul, you notice something odd beneath the mattress, a slight dip, a sag in the center of the bed that throws your hips off alignment and gives your spine the early onset shape of a question mark. You press down with your hand, and instead of hitting slats or springs, you feel rope, because under all that straw and communal warmth lies one of the most forgotten elements of the medieval bed. The support ropes. Yes, your entire body is currently resting on a grid of tightly pulled ropes woven across the bed frame, and they need maintenance regularly. Hence the origin of a phrase you probably mutter without thinking: sleep tight. It's not just a cute saying. It's literal advice from a world where, if you didn't keep your bed ropes tight, you'd sink like bread dough and wake up with a spine shaped like a pastry twist. These ropes, usually made of hemp or rush, were laced from side to side and top to bottom across the bed frame, forming a firm web that held the mattress above the cold floor. Over time, they stretched, they sagged, and so they had to be glance around the room. In the flickering light from the hearth's embers, you can just make out a wooden bed key hanging on the wall, a sturdy tool used to twist and tighten the rope grid, a chore for someone with upper body strength and patience. Without regular tightening, your bed went from mildly supportive to sleeping on a medieval trampoline after a feast day. And don't forget the wooden slats. In some households, particularly wealthier ones, rope was swapped for wood. These planks ran horizontally across the frame and supported the mattress. They were sturdier, less bouncy, but also unforgiving. One misplaced movement, and your elbow could meet a sharp, unyielding edge beneath a thin sack of hay. You sit up slowly, rubbing your back, which now feels like it's aged 40 years in the past 4 hours. The blankets slide off your shoulders, and you get a better look at the covers. No polyester here, no fleece, just heavy, woven, wool, scratchy, dark, and likely made by someone you met at the market yesterday. These blankets weren't always individual either. You weren't pulling your own duvet over your head in protest. In most medieval households, there was a single shared cover, one enormous swath of cloth pulled over the bed's entire human population like a tent. If someone rolled away, they probably took the warmth with them. This often led to subtle blanket wars, which, unlike today's petty tug-of war, could result in actual frostbite if you lost. Blankets, like beds, were valuable. A good wool coverlet was worth a lot, often dyed with natural colors or stitched with family insignia. They were passed down in wills, carefully repaired, sometimes boiled to kill pests, sometimes aired out in spring over the hedges. Like giant flags of survival, historians still argue whether the use of multiple layers of bedding, mattress, bolster, sheet, blanket, quilt was standard across social classes, or more of a noble luxury. Some evidence suggests even poorer households layered what they had: straw mattress, maybe an old cloak, and a coarse blanket thick with time and memory. Others insist the layering was minimal outside the manors and monasteries. Either way, there was rarely such a thing as a fresh set of sheets. Speaking of sheets, if you're lucky enough to be sleeping in a house with linen sheets, congratulations. You've stumbled into a relatively well-off household. Linen was expensive and required careful washing and bleaching. Most people didn't own many sheets, and what they had was often reused long past the point of comfort. You lean forward, eyeing the headboard. It's tall and carved, with some faint pattern worn into its face. Maybe a vine motif, maybe just scratches from generations of fidgeting. In wealthier homes, these headboards were sometimes intricately carved, even painted. One noblewoman's inventory once listed her bed's headboard as gilded with red and gold flowers, and a peacock sat upon a perch. And you thought your IKEA bed was fancy. Down at the foot of the bed, a heavy board sometimes called a bedstaff rests against the frame. This wasn't just decorative. It could be used to beat dust out of the mattress, whack an errant animal from the bedding, or even prod a bedmate to stop snoring. A medieval, all-purpose sleep accessory. You lie back again, letting your head rest on the bolster, basically a big tube of fabric stuffed with straw or rags. It's not exactly a pillow, but it props your head just enough to keep your dreams slightly elevated. The canopy above sways gently as someone walks past outside. If you're in a noble house, it's richly dyed fabric, maybe even velvet, designed to impress and keep heat in. If you're in a cottage, it might be an old curtain or linen sheet, practical, nothing more. The point is, every part of the bed had a purpose. The ropes held you up. The slats gave you structure. The bolster kept you semi-upright. The blankets trapped the warmth. The canopy kept the rats from falling directly on your face. All working together in a creaky, scratchy, sometimes smelly harmony to get you through the long medieval night. And somehow, it worked. People survived. They dreamed. They woke up aching, itchy, but alive, ready to tighten the ropes, refluff the straw, and start again. And as you drift back to sleep under a blanket that might have once been part of someone's wedding trousseau, you think, maybe sleep tight wasn't a gentle wish. Maybe it was a reminder, because if you didn't, you were probably rolling through the ropes and onto the stone floor before morning. You wake with a sneeze, violent, echoing, and deeply unhelpful when you're trying to pretend you're still asleep. Dust particles dance in the early morning light, snaking through the small, grimy window, revealing just how much your medieval bedroom is less luxury suite and more museum of breathable debris. But you don't care, because this bed, this glorious, carved, fabric-draped marvel you've slept in, it is stunning. You shift your head slightly on the uneven bolster and gaze up at the arched canopy above you. Embroidered silk with faded gold thread glimmers faintly overhead. The fabric is heavy and lined. It traps warmth, dulls sound, and makes you feel like royalty, even if you still haven't shaken off the lice from 2 nights ago. This isn't an average peasant's sleeping nook. This is a noble's bed, and in the Middle Ages, that made it less of a resting place and more of a public statement. In fact, the wealthier you were, the fancier your bed became, and not necessarily because you cared more about comfort. Oh no. You cared about status, because beds weren't tucked into quiet back rooms like today. They were often placed prominently in chambers where others might see them. Visitors might pass through your sleeping quarters as part of courtly business. If you were powerful, people might attend you in bed, sit beside you while you reclined regally, or even receive royal proclamations at your bedstead. So you needed that bed to say something, preferably something like, "I'm important, I'm rich, and I absolutely did not inherit this from my cousin." That's why wealthy beds were draped in embroidered fabrics, velvet, brocade, or wool, dyed in rich hues like indigo, madder red, or woad blue. These were not easy colors to produce. Woad had to be fermented with you, guessed it, Turin, which means your gorgeous blue bed curtains might smell faintly of civic sacrifice. But wow, did they look great. The bed frame itself was often made of oak, heavy and carved with scenes from scripture or family crests. Posts rose high, framing the canopy above, sometimes with carved finials or decorative knobs. Some noble beds were so massive they required a small step stool to climb into. And yes, there were medieval bedstairs, teeny ladders to help you mount your nighttime throne. Historians still argue whether these beds were regularly moved between manors or just so cherished they stayed put. But records show some families did transport their beds, especially during travel or war. Royal retinues had bed frames broken down and packed, carried with all the seriousness of a military campaign. You don't truly rule until you've demanded your canopy be carted over 200 miles by mule. And then there were the testers, no, not the ones you find in shampoo ads. A tester was the top panel of the canopy, often decorated and designed to keep out the cold and the nosy. Paired with thick side curtains, it offered privacy in a world where everyone saw everything. It created a sort of bedroom within a bedroom, a stage where sleep, illness, birth, and death all played out. You run a hand along the fabric at your side and feel the textured stitching of someone's initials. Monogramming, medieval edition. Linens, pillowcases, and even quilts were embroidered, with names and sometimes biblical verses, partially for pride, partially because you never knew when your stuff might get borrowed, in a shared household with servants, relatives, and the occasional opportunistic guest, claiming your bedding was just practical. But here's a weird little detail. People often sat, or even ate in their beds. In noble homes, the bedchamber doubled as a living space. A fire roared in the hearth, and you might conduct business, receive visitors, or enjoy a light meal all from the plush nest of your feather mattress. Beds were furniture and function. Royal proclamations were sometimes signed bedside. Political marriages discussed under the quilts. Intrigue and diplomacy conducted on pillows with silk fringe. And yes, this means your enemies might literally try to murder you while you were snuggled under your best brocade. No pressure. You glance at the finely stitched canopy and spot a bit of fraying along the edge. Even these extravagant beds wore out. Repairs were common. Tapestries had to be mended, bolsters restuffed, rope supports replaced. Servants were assigned to the care of the bed itself, not just changing linens, but brushing the velvet, dusting the carvings, even keeping the bug population to a manageable roar. Meanwhile, if you strolled outside this noble chamber into a commoner's cottage, the difference was night and day. There, a bed might be just a straw mattress in a corner, covered with a patched wool blanket, and shared by half the household. Or a simple wooden frame draped with a coarse linen sheet that someone had definitely died on, and no one ever really washed. The class divide between beds was stark. In the castle, wealth, color, comfort, relatively speaking, and carved wood worth more than a cow. In the village, practicality, proximity, and a straw pile that smelled faintly like the neighbor's. Goat. And then there were monks. You think of their hard, narrow cots and simple woolen blankets. In monasteries, luxury was a sin. Beds were about humility, about denial. One blanket, one pillow, if any. Ropes or slats beneath, just like you, but no canopy, no feathers, no fuss. The truly devout even slept on boards or the floor. Some historians believe monks deliberately disrupted their own sleep to avoid temptation, to stay alert for prayer, and probably because mattress mites would have been too indulgent. So, as you lie here, wrapped in the warm folds of someone else's very expensive bedding, you understand what this bed is. Not just a place to sleep, but a message. A statement carved in oak and embroidered in gold. It says, "This is who I am. This is what I have. And yes, this is where I snore." And with that comforting thought, you turn your head to the side, letting your cheek press into a pillow that's stuffed with duck feathers and the confidence of centuries of noble bed owners. You blink awake again, just barely this time, and realize the light is different, colder, grayer. You stretch and bump into no one, no Wilfred, no snoring cousin, no scratching child. In fact, there's no mattress, no bed frame, just hard-packed earth and a faint ache in your hips from sleeping on it. Welcome to the peasant's bed, or rather, the idea of it, because unlike the noble's carved wooden sanctuary you enjoyed hours ago, most medieval folk had a far humbler experience with bedtime. In some homes, that meant no bed at all. Instead, you slept on the floor, or on a low platform of planks, or sometimes even directly on a pile of reeds, hay, or bracken, the stiff, itchy kind of fern that grows just about anywhere. It crunched beneath you like dry cereal and smelled faintly of damp moss and barnyard, but it kept you off the cold, and that was really the only requirement, if you were lucky. Someone stitched you a rough straw tick to lay on, a sack the size of your torso filled with something vaguely soft adjacent, but without a frame or ropes. You were always just one careless toss away from rolling into the ashes of last night's fire or someone else's foot. Still, every class had its own version of bedtime, and you're now going to visit them all. You sit up slowly, brushing straw from your tunic, and glance around the single-room cottage. A low ceiling, a thatched roof, with more daylight than you'd like. The bed, if we're generous, is just a raised wooden box filled with straw and 2 flat linen sacks for pillows. The blanket is undyed wool, coarse and thin. And yet, this setup is better than what many had. Some peasants didn't even have designated beds. Instead, they shared floor space with livestock, wrapping themselves in cloaks or bundled garments. The body heat from a goat or pig wasn't glamorous, but it beat freezing to death. Historians still argue whether most peasants had any kind of bed structure, or if the straw floor setup was more typical. Some evidence from wills and household inventories suggests even modest families valued their bed-like contraptions and repaired or inherited them across generations. Others believe that for the truly poor, the bed was just wherever the fire wasn, single quotes t, from the village hut. You fast-forward your dreamlike stroll into the peaceful, cloistered world of the monastery. It's just before matins, the middle of a night prayer, and the dormitory is cold and silent. Long rows of wooden cots stretch along the stone walls, spaced with perfect order. There are no curtains, no privacy, just simple mattresses that laid on hard boards. Blankets are plain wool. Sheets, if they exist, are rarely washed. Monks weren't here to rest luxuriously. Sleep was a tool for spiritual discipline. Too much of it, and you risked slipping into laziness. Beds were not indulgent, but intentional. Some monks slept sitting up, others used stones or folded robes in place of pillows. There's even evidence that, particularly ascetic individuals, deliberately disrupted their own sleep to keep themselves spiritually on alert, because nothing says godly like chronic exhaustion. You shiver a little, despite the mental image of all that pious intention, and suddenly you're whisked again, this time into the solar of a merchant's house. You're somewhere between the peasants' hay pile and the noble's bed castle. This bedroom is warmer, with wooden floors and a modest bed tucked into a corner under a small canopy. The mattress is still straw, but it's stuffed into a thick sack with a faint scent of rosemary and wormwood, likely added to repel lice or possibly in vain hope of impressing the merchant's second wife. You run your hand along the bed frame. It's simpler than the noble's but sturdy, homemade. The ropes underneath sag a little, and the mattress bulges where it's been sat on too many times in the same spot. Still, it's a bed, and in this house, it's probably where the merchant's whole life played out. He was born in this bed, maybe, had his children in it, might die in it. Back in the city, wealthy burghers and minor gentry had larger bedrooms. These beds, though not as opulent as noble ones, were still status symbols. They had canopies, curtains, bed chests filled with extra linens. Some even had embroidered sheets. But no matter how nice the bed, it remained the scene of a strange, communal intimacy. Children still clambered in during the night. Servants might sleep at the foot. A guest might share the space when lodging options were thin. And now, for contrast, you walk once more into a royal chamber. It's past midnight. The stone walls are draped in expensive tapestries. The fire burns clean and warm. A bed rises before you like an altar, tall, ornate, carved, and layered with every fabric known to man. Goosefeather mattresses, quilts thick as winter cloaks, pillows embroidered with golden thread. But even here, a servant sleeps nearby on a pallet. A chambermaid nods off in a corner chair. The king or queen is never truly alone. Even in luxury, the shared nature of medieval sleep endures. Privacy is a myth, quiet, a privilege, and yet, sleep finds everyone, whether curled in a straw pile beside a pig or lying beneath silk imported from Constantinople. People dreamed, they snored, they turned over and fought for blanket space. They rubbed sore shoulders. They whispered bedtime prayers, because no matter how different the material, wood, straw, or velvet, the act of sleeping was the same. The body asked for rest, the bed whatever form it took, and you stir in the middle of the night, suddenly aware that something isn't right. It's not the cold that's constant, nor is it Wilfred's absence, now fondly missed. It's something deeper, more primal. Your bladder, a common, thoroughly human inconvenience magnified to horrifying proportions in the medieval world. Because the real danger of sleeping in 1372 isn't the lice or the bed bugs. It's having to go to the bathroom at midnight. You peel back the scratchy blanket and slide one foot onto the cold floor. There's no soft lamp to guide your way, no night light, just complete blackness, save for the faint glow of embers in the hearth. Every floorboard creaks like it's auditioning for a haunted house. You glance across the room, hoping for a chamber pot nearby. If you're lucky, there's one under the bed, typically made of ceramic or metal. It's cold, it smells faintly of ammonia, but it saves you from venturing into the real abyss, outside. For those without a pot or a strong stomach, midnight relief meant braving the elements. Medieval homes didn't have indoor plumbing. Latrines, where they existed, were often in separate buildings or down dangerously steep steps in a stone-walled corner of the house. Think of it as a terrifying maze of broken planks, icy air, and the faint but unmistakable sense that someone or something is watching. In cities, people dumped chamber pot contents into the street, often yelling "Gardy-loo" as a warning. In rural homes, waste might be tossed in a ditch or piled in a midden. You try not to imagine it as you inch toward the corner of the room, hoping not to step in anything regrettable. You trip over a low stool and stifle a yelp. Outside, the wind howls. Rain taps against the shuttered window. Somewhere, a dog barks. It's very possible that dog is also using the yard as a toilet. In castles, things weren't always better. Sure, there were garderobes, medieval toilets that jutted out from the stone walls. Waste dropped straight into a pit, or, more horrifyingly, a moat. But at night, few dared to use them. Cold, windy, and incredibly drafty, they were essentially indoor cliffs with holes in them. You risked more than your dignity every time you visited. Some households had closed stools, wooden boxes with holes in the top, and a pot underneath, often covered by cushions during the day. These were more common in upper-class homes, but even then, servants had to carry the waste away each morning. One of the least glamorous jobs in an already unforgiving world. Historians still argue whether chamber pots were shared within families, or if certain members had personal ones. Some records suggest individual pots existed monogrammed. Even others suggest a more communal approach, especially in large households. Either way, It wasn't exactly sanitary, or smell-free. You finally spot the pot tucked under the edge of the bed. Success, as you gingerly handle it in the dark. You try not to knock anything over, or alert any mice. You do what you must, carefully, quickly, quietly. And then comes the dilemma: empty it now, or leave it for morning. Most chose the latter. Emptying pots at night meant going outside, into the cold. Or worse, navigating slippery stairs with only a tallow candle to guide you. Many pots stayed full until daybreak, and the smell, well, people in the Middle Ages had different thresholds. They burned herbs. They hung bundles of dried lavender or rosemary. They opened shutters when they could, but mostly they just lived with it. Back in bed, you try to shake off the chill. The blanket is damp from dew, or maybe just atmospheric betrayal. You curl into yourself, hoping sleep will return. It does, slowly, just as a soft snore rises from across the room. Someone else is back in bed, likely unaware of the near-death experience you just had trying to pee without falling into a moat. But it wasn't all horror. Some people used heated stones, or small metal pans filled with embers, to warm the bed before turning in, though more than one house burned down from a misplaced brazier. Still, the luxury of a warm bed was enough to tempt fate. Then there were the snacks. Midnight snacks weren't unheard of, especially for the rich. A bit of bread, a chunk of cheese, maybe some warm ale or spiced wine. Food was kept under bed chests or wrapped in cloth. Some believed a bite before sleep helped digestion. Others simply didn't have the time or energy to eat earlier in the day. So a secret mouthful of honeyed cake under the blankets. That was a quiet pleasure if you could keep it away from the rats. And the rats did come. Attracted by crumbs, waste, warmth, or just general curiosity. They scuttled along beams, rustled in walls, and occasionally dropped from rafters with the acrobatic flair of unwelcome circus performers. Bed canopies weren't just decorative, they were rat shields. You shift under your blanket, now more awake than ever, and try to pretend the soft scritching near the wall is just the wind, or a dream, or Wilfred. Some households trained cats to sleep near the bed, their job, half companionship, half pest control. A good mouser could make the difference between peaceful sleep and a shrieking midnight rodent drama. Dogs, too, had their place, usually curled at the foot of the bed, helping guard, snuggle, or sometimes steal bits of whatever you were eating in the dark. You think again about the noble you were earlier, reclining in embroidered splendor with a close stool and silk sheets. Then about the monk, quietly praying instead of sneaking cheese by candlelight. And finally, the peasant who, if they had to relieve themselves, probably walked barefoot through a freezing yard to squat behind the pigpen, and through it all, every medieval sleeper, in every kind of bed, faced the same terrifying truth. Sooner or later, you'd have to get up in the dark, and you probably wouldn't like what you stepped in. You finally drift back to sleep, your toes slowly thawing under the wool blanket, when something odd stirs you awake again. Not a sound, not a smell, but a feeling, a strange heaviness in your chest, a sense of presence, and for a moment, you wonder, was that just a dream, or something more? In the Middle Ages, dreams weren't merely dismissed as brain static, they were messages, and not necessarily pleasant ones. You lie there, barely breathing. As your mind wanders back to what just unfolded behind your eyes, a wolf made of smoke, a staircase that spiraled into fire, your grandmother shouting something in Latin while riding a turnip, confused. You're not alone. In medieval Europe, dreams were often seen as symbolic communications, demonic or prophetic. People didn't have dream journals. They had dream manuals, passed around in monasteries and manors alike, each promising to unlock the secrets of the unconscious mind. If you dreamed of water, perhaps it meant sorrow. A bird might signal news. Teeth falling out. You guessed it, deaths on the doorstep, or maybe just bad hygiene. Scholars and mystics alike pored over these symbols with the same energy modern fans bring to decoding movie trailers. In fact, entire sermons were written on the topic of dreams. Monks and nuns debated whether nighttime visions were sinful distractions or holy insights. Saints claimed their dreams were messages from God. Sinners feared theirs were whispers from below. Historians still argue whether dream interpretation was truly widespread among the common folk, or more of an elite obsession. Some argue peasants saw dreams as superstitions helpful, maybe, but not worthy of the church's scrutiny. Others suggest even the humblest shepherd might wake with a furrowed brow and mutter, "The ox spoke Latin again. I must consult Father Gregory." And consult they did. Priests and abbots often acted as sleep therapists, decoding symbols and delivering reassurance or penance. A dream of falling might mean you were spiritually slipping. A dream of flying, you'd either found grace or eaten suspect mushrooms. You roll over, still mulling your turn upright in granny, and spot a monk dozing nearby, his head bowed and his hands clasped. This isn't your bed anymore. This is a monastery dormitory, cold and hushed, lit by the faint, pre-dawn glow. The monk stirs, his lips moving in a silent prayer. Perhaps he's thanking God for a peaceful dream. Or maybe he's warding off the other kind. Medieval people didn't just interpret dreams, they feared them. A bad dream might be an omen, a warning, in times of plague or famine. Terrifying visions were taken seriously, sometimes sparking entire community rituals meant to drive out evil. Holy water, chanting, even processions through the village, all to scrub away the psychic grime of one bad night's sleep. There was even a belief that demons could invade your dreams. Not metaphorically, literally. Incubi and succubi, malevolent spirits that haunted sleeping humans, were widely believed to torment the pious in the night. These weren't fairy tales. Church doctrine and confessions of the time treated such experiences with deadly seriousness. You curled deeper into the blanket, your shoulder brushing against the bed's edge, and you wonder, if dreams were so powerful, how did people prepare for them? Well, some took bedtime prayers very seriously. "Now I lay me down to sleep" wasn't just a sweet rhyme, it was a defense mechanism. People crossed themselves, said psalms, whispered protective invocations. Some even carried talismans, or wore amulets sewn into their nightclothes, invoking saints or angels to protect their sleep. Think of it as spiritual armor for REM sleep. You hear someone mutter nearby, "It's Wilfred again, he's back. Bless him, and he's clearly dreaming. His brow is furrowed. He twitches." Then, in a surprisingly high-pitched voice, he whispers, ... the goat knows. Before going still again, you make a mental note not to ask, and dreams weren't just feared, they were respected. Royal courts occasionally recorded dreams that kings or queens claimed had guided their decisions. Marriages were postponed, wars initiated, crops blessed or burned, all because someone dreamed of a snake wearing a crown. The line between vision and reality blurred easily when your reality was already mysterious, unstable, and full of plagues. Even the medical profession weighed in. According to medieval humoral theory, your dreams could be caused by what you ate. Heavy meat before bed. Expect nightmares. Lettuce. Peaceful sleep. The wrong combination might even cause dream fevers, a condition supposedly triggered by corrupted vapors in the brain. The solution: fewer onions. Possibly bloodletting. There were also dreams people wanted to have. Visions of saints. Apparitions of Mary. Visitations from deceased loved ones, bearing good news. These were welcomed, cherished, and sometimes written down. Monks might spend years pursuing such dreams through fasting and vigil. Sleep became a doorway to heaven, or a very long hallway with a devil at the end. You close your eyes again, sensing sleep returning, and think of your own dream. Was the turnip symbolic? Was Granny's Latin phrase a clue? or just your brain mixing dinner with stress and old memories. Whatever it was, you understand now why people in the Middle Ages took dreams seriously. In a world where the day was filled with toil and terror, the night was full of messages, some helpful, some horrifying. You didn't just sleep, you journeyed, you interpreted, you hoped to wake better off, or at least not cursed, as you finally drift back down into sleep, wrapped once again in wool and shadows. You whisper a little prayer, just in case, because tonight, the goat might speak again. You awaken just before dawn, not because you want to, but because the world around you insists on it. A cock crows somewhere beyond the frost-glazed shutters. Your toes have escaped the blanket again, and you now understand why medieval folks layered up, even in bed. Every breath comes out in a visible puff. Your nose is numb. You blink into the dimness and realize something terrible. It's time to get up, not in the snooze your alarm 5 times and chug coffee kind of way. No, in the it's freezing, it's dark, and you have chores waiting kind of way. You've groaned softly, but the room's already stirring. Wilfred has rolled over and begun to mutter about sheep again. Somewhere nearby, a child coughs. A dog stretches and yawns at the hearth, and outside, the village is beginning to move. Welcome to medieval mornings where sleep ends not with a chime, but with responsibility. You sit up stiffly, your back aching from the uneven straw and sagging ropes beneath you. Every joint seems to voice a small complaint. The blanket slides to your lap, releasing a puff of cold air that hits like a bucket of medieval ice water. No one's lighting fires yet, not unless it's your job to do so, and unfortunately, today, it is in a time before alarm clocks. People woke with the sun, or sometimes long before. Farmers rose to tend animals. Bakers were already kneading dough. Monks rose for lauds, the early morning prayer, sometimes after barely 4 hours of rest. There was no such thing as a leisurely line, unless you were gravely ill, or incredibly rich, and even the rich didn't sleep in as much as you might think. Nobles had a household to run. They were expected to show leadership, or at the very least, have someone brush their hair and ask about crop yields. The idea of 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep didn't really exist. Instead, many medieval people followed a segmented sleep pattern. First sleep, then a short period of wakefulness around midnight, followed by second sleep until dawn. That midnight window where you made your bathroom dash, had a snack, whispered with your bedmate, or prayed, was considered perfectly normal. Historians still debate whether this Befosic sleep was universal. Some argue it was a product of long winter nights in Northern Europe. Others think it may have been more flexibly a matter of lifestyle, season, or status. Either way, the modern expectation of one solid block of unconsciousness, not a thing. You rub your eyes and swing your legs over the side of the bed. The floor is cruel beneath your bare feet. There are no slippers, no fuzzy rugs, just planks or packed earth. You step lightly to avoid the coldest spots or the places where someone else may have spilled something last night. A quick look around the room shows signs of a long shared night. A tangle of limbs still deep in sleep, a low-burning hearth, and your trusty chamber pot, now full. Sitting quietly in the shadows like a cursed trophy, you dress quickly, pulling on yesterday's clothes, because there are no pajamas. Sleepwear was minimal, often just a linen shift or whatever you wore to bed. In winter, people sometimes slept in layers, hats included, to keep warm. Nightcaps weren't a fashion statement, they were a necessity. You miss yours. You spot a bundle of kindling by the hearth and sigh. Fire needs to be coaxed back to life, and until it's crackling, the chill remains sharp. Your breath fogs in, the air like a reluctant ghost. The dog huffs from its place by the ashes, clearly unimpressed with your work ethic. As you move through your morning duties, the residue of sleep still clings. Your shoulders ache, your neck feels twisted, but this is normal. Comfort, was not expected. People woke tired, worked tired, and slept tired. Exhaustion was a kind of constant companion, woven into every layer of medieval life, like dust into a wool blanket. You think again of your dream, of demons and turnips and goats. It seems distant now, dissolved into daylight and duty. But you carry its echo with you as you grab a splintery pail and head outside toward the well. Your breath clouds the morning air. Frost crunches beneath your feet, and somewhere in the distance, a woman yells at a pig, a cart squeals against the road, and a child bursts into the kind of spontaneous wail only medieval toddlers seem to perfect. You turn back and glance at the house, where your bed still waits, cold, rumpled, unwelcoming. You'll return to it in 14 hours, if you're lucky, but until then, the day stretches long ahead of you, filled with tasks, obligations, and the unspoken hope that tonight, the straw might settle just right, and Wilfred might not drool on your shoulder. Because, while medieval beds were short, itchy, and full of mysteries, they were also one thing that modern beds rarely are earned. Every time you collapse onto that sack of straw and ropes, it's after a day of walking, hauling, mending, and surviving. Sleep doesn't just happen, it arrives, like a blessing you may or may not deserve, and that's what makes it sweet. So, now, as the embers fade and the softest hush settles over the world outside, let your breath slow. There's no need to reach for anything, no tasks left, no voices. Just the quiet rustle of blankets, the gentle tick of your pulse, and the long, slow exhale of a day finally done. The bed you imagine beneath you now might be short, perhaps lumpy, perhaps shared, but it's yours for the moment, and that moment is more than enough. Let the night wrap around you like those old woolen blankets, coarse, perhaps, but warm. Let it settle into your bones, into the spaces between thoughts, where dreams begin to form, strange and tangled, like vines in a forgotten garden. You might see a flicker of candlelight in the dark. You might feel the cool press of stone under your bare feet, or perhaps just the breath of the wind through wooden beams overhead. Let it all drift. Let the weight of centuries soften. Let yourself rest. The chores will wait. The goats can manage. And if you dream of wolves, or of whispered Latin, or of flying geese made of bread, know that you're simply traveling through time, in a bed that someone long ago once called their own. Sleep well, my friend. Sleep tight. Don't let the medieval bedbugs bite. End of script. Sweet dreams.